Well, for me, the story of Synaptics started in 1960 when I first met Gordon Moore. He visited me in my lab at Caltech and gave me some transistors to use to teach my courses with. That was a very auspicious meeting, and Gordon invited me to come up to Fairchild, where he and Bob Noyce were doing a lot of cutting-edge transistor work, and do some consulting with them, which I did. And Gordon and I became good friends, and we did a lot of good work together until the later 60s. And I was in a meeting with Gordon in Boulder, Colorado, and he told me that he had left Fairchild. That was a big shock, of course, for me, because we'd been working together for many years. So I said, let's go out to dinner and talk about it. So Gordon and I had a really nice talk that evening, and he said that he and Bob Noyce were thinking about starting a new company, and would I like to come over to his house one of these days when I was in Silicon Valley and talk about it. So of course I did, and they did start a new company, and one of the first people they got involved with them was Andy Grove. I was a consultant for them even before they started the company. Became badge number 5 at this new company called Intel. I wasn't an employee, but I consulted with them and helped them get going. And a little later, they hired a fellow by the name of Federico Fagin. And Federico was the one that, with a guy by the name of Klein, worked up the 4004, which was the first commercially successful microprocessor, which Intel produced in volume. And so I got to work with Federico on the early microprocessor technology, and that was a lot of fun. And Federico and I became friends. Then Federico left and started another company called Zilog. And Zilog produced a competitive set of microprocessors. That was fine. I used to stop and see him at Zilog. And then I got to working on a different set of things. I had been working on transistor physics and that sort of thing. And I went off and started working on biological systems, and I had gotten very interested in how animals and the brains of animals processed information. And could we do something like that in silicon? And if we really understand how that worked, we could make silicon circuits that would work like the sensory sections of animals' brains, and that would be very exciting. And we teamed up with some biologists at Caltech and started a whole new discipline to do that, which is still going on to this day. And I sort of lost track of Federico. But then one day I got this call, and my assistant said, there's this fellow who says he's a friend of yours. His name is Federico. And I said, yes, he's a friend of mine. And Federico wanted to come down and visit. Well, that was great. So he came and visited, and I set him up with a bunch of the grad students so he could see their progress on their projects. And we were making chips that did some of the functions that the retina in the eye does, and the cochlea in the ear does. So Federico got to see all that, and then the two of us went out to dinner, and he said he'd been doing some work in software neural networks. And that was just at the time when neural networks was getting to be a buzzword. And there were a lot of people making software programs to do some simple kind of network processing. But none of them were anywhere near good enough to handle the real-time data that came out of a stream of sound or a visual scene. So Federico and I started talking, and he said, next time you're up in Silicon Valley, let's go to dinner and let's talk some more about how we might work together. I said, well, that sounds great. So we got together and drove up to Skyline, and there used to be a restaurant right at the corner of 84 and Skyline, across Skyline from Alice's restaurant. And it had a big fireplace and served really good food. I think it only does private parties now, but it used to be a great place to eat. So we went up there and had a nice dinner. And on the way back down the hill, we were talking, and Federico said, I think if we join forces, we could do better than either one of us going alone. And I said, well, that sounds right. So it turned out that Federico and a colleague of his, who was a professor down at UC Irvine, I forget his name, had already started a little think tank called Synaptics, which I thought was a really clever name. It came from the synapses in the brain, of course. And he said, we're going to be taking on a new round of funding, and if you work with us on this, we'll do better in the funding. And so we joined forces and came up with a business plan. And We both could see that if we were going to tackle the problem of sensory systems, that we needed hardware, not just software. We couldn't just use a microprocessor. That wasn't going to work. So we got a good round of funding, and we started working together. And we had identified 3 senses that we thought we could do something about. We could do hearing, or we could do vision, or we could do touch. And of course, we thought about taste and smell, but neither one of us had any real experience with biochemistry. And if you want to do taste or smell, you're really deep in biochemistry, and we just didn't have the background for that. So we stuck with the other 3 senses. And we started little projects on each one of them. We were building a little silicon cochlea, and we built some little rudimentary silicon retinas, and we were trying to start a project to do touch. Then, of course, we started looking for applications, somebody that would want one of the results that we were doing. And we talked to a lot of people. And we finally got a hit, and it was a company that made the little point-of-sale terminals that used to sit on everybody's counter. And they were simple in those days. They were just a little box that hooked up to a phone line, and you would swipe a credit card in them and then punch in the amount, and it would either verify it or not verify it. I think they called it Verifone. And they were at that time the major supplier of those gadgets. And they had a good idea. They said, we're going to make a higher-end point-of-sale device. So instead of just being able to swipe credit cards, we want to be able to swipe checks. And we want to be able to read the characters that, every check has a check account number on it. And we want to be able to read the characters that identify that account so we can check out the account. Well, that sounded reasonable, except those characters, they're called MICR, M-I-C-R, and they're printed in magnetic ink. So the obvious way to read them is like you read a magnetic tape or the magnetic stripe on the credit card. So we said, well, why don't you just do it that way? And they said, well, if you try to read them magnetically, the signal you get depends on how fast you swipe it. If you swipe it twice as fast, the signal's twice as big. And that makes it very, very hard to untangle the identity of the characters. So we want to do it optically, so that no matter how fast or slow you swipe it, you get an image of the characters and you can recognize them. Well, they're pretty simple characters, and we figured we could do that. So we had, by then, a number of young people in the company. Federico is very, very good with young people, and when any one of my students would be graduating, they would come around and ask me where they should go to work. And I'd say, well, I'm not going to tell you where you should go to work, but I'll introduce you to the people I know. And one of the people I would always introduce them to was Federico. And he was very good about spotting the bright ones and really allowing them to grow into a lot of responsibility that was more than they would be given in a larger company. And so we had a number of my former students in the company by then. Tim Allen and John Platt and Dave Gillespie, who you know, and a number of other really bright young people. And they were off doing these projects and coming up with good ideas. So Tim Allen and a couple of his colleagues got together to do this project with reading the MICR characters on a check when you swiped them by hand. And of course, the first thing you want to know is where are you going to get a sample of those things? You don't just go around asking people for their checks. And so Tim found out that down in San Jose somewhere there was a company that had a big room full of files of bad checks. And if you paid the amount that they had paid on the bad check, you could have the check. And so he went down and spent a whole afternoon finding bad checks that didn't cost too much. And so we ended up with a sample set of maybe a couple hundred checks. So the guys got together and they designed a little sensor and an optical system and figured out how to organize the whole thing. And we're getting images off these things, and they were recognizing them. And after about a year, we had a system that would actually recognize the MICR characters on the check no matter how fast you swiped them. So we were just ready to demo this thing, so we called up Verifone and said, hey, we want you to come down and look at this. And we got this long silence from the vice president we'd been working with there. And he said, oh, we forgot to tell you, that project's been canceled. So here we'd spent a year and a bunch of engineering effort and some really bright people, and the market just went away. Well, of course, we were disappointed and a little bit angry, maybe a lot angry, but we had learned a lot. So we got to looking at other applications. And the way I used to work, I would fly in Thursday night, and then I'd take my consulting day from my faculty position at Caltech on Friday and work with the company. And then if people were around Saturdays, which they mostly were, I would work with them then, and sort of a rhythm with me. So I came in one Friday morning, and Tim came up to me and said, "Carver, can we have lunch?" Well, that was always code for, I have something I want to talk to you about. So we went up to late for the train, which was just off 101 up in Menlo Park. I don't think it's there anymore. But we went there and had a nice long talk over lunch. And Tim said, "I don't think we're making any progress the way we're doing this touchpad. And I have an idea that I know will work." Well, when Tim said something like this, I always paid attention to it, because Tim was one of our brightest people and very creative and had very innovative ideas. So he laid out for me step by step how he was going to do this thing, what kind of a sensor he was going to build, how it was going to be wired up on its circuit board that had the capacitive stripes in it, and how it was going to be scanned and how it was going to be processed, and he had figured the whole thing out. And it sounded really good. It was another one of his very interesting, very innovative ideas. So I said, "Well, Tim, you know, we've already had several tries at the touchpad, and they hadn't worked out very well. And if you want people to believe this, you're going to have to write it up." Well, Tim wasn't really good at writing things up. He was good at designing things and building things and making them work. But I said, "You've got to make this a compelling proposal." So he went off and he spent the next week getting this written down. And when I came back the next week, he had a pretty good document. So I worked with him for a day or two to get it to where it was really compelling. And at that time, Federico was off in Japan looking for business over there, which is, at that time, the Japanese were doing a lot of innovative stuff and was a good place to look for business. So I called up his hotel and finally got in touch with him. And I said, "Hey, Tim's come up with a really good thing. Do you suppose you could read it on the plane on the way back?" He said, "Sure, send it to me." So those are the old days. I faxed it to him at his hotel. And so when he got back, the three of us sat down, and Federico had a lot of questions, and he finally said, "Sure, go ahead and do it." And that was the thing that turned into the Synaptics we know today, was that first touchpad that really worked, which was the one Tim Allen came up with. And there's a lot of funny stories that went with the development of a thing like that. You can imagine it was not a particularly easy job, still isn't to this day. We went through a lot of learning in the process of trying to figure out all the details. Not only was there the sensor and the electronic processing of the sensor, but there was the software that went to how to interpret all that. And that was where Dave Gillespie shined, and still does today. We had a lot of fun. When the first chips came back, of course, we had to test them. Well, you can't just go to any testing house and have them test a chip that senses all these analog signals and does all that. So the guys built a little box that had a bunch of electronics in it that interfaced to the chip, and then interfaced to the software in a computer which had the testing program. And they had it set up so that when a chip ended up being good, the computer would put out on a little speaker they had, it would say, "Excellent." And when there was a bad chip, it would say, "Bogus." So we would sit working on various aspects of the touchpad, and we'd hear this in the background. "Excellent." "Bogus." "Bogus." "Excellent." So we could tell what the yield was of this chip just by listening to how many of the words of each kind were coming out. And of course, we not only had to test the chips electronically, we had to check out how well the system worked. And touchpad isn't just about following your finger. It's about gestures. You have to be able to tap and do double taps and do a swipe so you can move things. And so how are you going to test that? It's a user interface problem. And Dave Gillespie would come up with the latest gesture, but then we had to check that out. So all of us, of course, were volunteers to check out the latest version of Dave's software that was interpreting signals from the latest version of Tim's chip and firmware. So, well, what are you going to do? Well, it turned out that the rule was we all played solitaire. And you had to play solitaire just with a touchpad. You couldn't use any buttons or anything else. So it had to really interpret the gestures you had. And we all got pretty good at solitaire, but you could tell right away if something was better or worse with the software and with the chip. So we got pretty good at all that, and in the process, because we were using our own product, it evolved very rapidly. Got better because we would go share with Tim and Dave what we thought was better and what wasn't as good, and they would think about it and go improve things. That was just a glorious time when the touchpad was just getting better. Every few days there would be an improvement, and it was getting easier and easier to play better and better solitaire, and so that was fun. So then we were getting good enough that we were thinking we need to look for somebody who could use this. And just that time, Apple came out with, I think they called it a PowerBook, I'm not absolutely sure. And it had a touchpad in it. It was the first laptop to come out with a touchpad in it. And we thought, wow, this is a godsend. Because once Apple did something, then everybody wanted to copy it. And so there would be a lot of people who would like to buy our touchpad and make a copy of Apple's PowerBook, I think. So we went down the street to Acer. Acer was a company, I guess still exists, that does a lot of, I think they sell under their own brand in the Far East. They're Taiwanese. They were fantastic at doing very, very quick turnaround designs. So they were really excited about working with us because they saw this would be a great opportunity in the marketplace. So we started working with them. And there's a funny story about that. We, of course, we had our touchpad set up with our stuff, but we had to interface it to this laptop. Well, the interface to the pointing device in the laptop in those days, I don't know how it works today, but in those days it was through a little chip called the BIOS, which was just a little piece of very low-level software that interfaced the various hardware components of the chip and made the communication work. And, well, this BIOS was just a little non-volatile memory chip and was made by a company called Phoenix in those days. And Acer was using the Phoenix BIOS. Well, they could support a mouse and they could support a trackball, but they didn't have enough capability to support a touchpad. And Dave worked and we all struggled with it, but we could never get it really interfaced right because they're just missing some important capability. So we called them up and said, hey, we want to talk to someone about this and this and this. We must have called them 20 times. They never returned our phone calls. So finally, Dave Gillespie, being Dave, took the little chip out, read the contents into a file, disassembled it, figured out how it worked, figured out how to fix it so it would work with our touchpad, reassembled it, put it back in the chip, plugged the chip back in the Acer laptop, and got it to work. That's just Dave. I'm sure he's doing that kind of thing to this day at a much higher level. So we went in and we demonstrated it to the Acer guys, and they were ecstatic. They wanted to go with it. They wanted to get a new model with this in it. And we said, oh, well, there's only one problem. It doesn't work with Phoenix BIOS the way it comes. Well, we can fix that. So they called up Phoenix and they said, your BIOS doesn't work with a Synaptics touchpad. You need to fix it. So we got this phone call from Phoenix, first phone call we'd ever had from Phoenix. We'd be happy to work with you. Come on over. So Dave went over there. I think it was Dave and Tim actually went over. And they started to explain what had happened. And they said, so the guys looked at it and said, well, how did you get it to work? And they said, well, we disassembled your BIOS and figured out where the problem was, and we patched it so it'd work. And they said, you did what? You can't do that. That's not legal. They said, well, we couldn't get you to answer your phone. And they finally came down off the ceiling and worked with us, and that all got straightened out. But it was very funny to see their change in attitude when they were faced with a real customer that wanted the results. So we had a project going at Acer, and we had a sales guy. His name was Bob. I forget his last name. Big, tall, craggy guy. And he was fearless. He would go in anywhere, which you have to be a sales guy. So we had got this deal going with Acer, and he said, now we're going to Apple. And I looked at him and I said, Bob, you're out of your mind. They'll chew you up and spit you out the window if you walk into Apple. They don't deal with little companies like us. Bob said, we're going in anyway. Said, well, that was Bob. That was great. So Bob and Tim went down to Apple, and they had made an appointment. They wanted to talk with somebody about supplying them a touchpad. So they walked in and met with this young guy that had been assigned to talk to this little company. And the guy said, what is it you want to talk about? And they said, well, we have a touchpad. He said, well, let me see it. So they brought out one of the prototype Acer laptop things and opened it up, made it work, and he looked and he said, oh, mind if I try it? And they said, no, sure, go ahead. So he started working with the touchpad, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you could tell he knew all the hard cases. So he tried to break it because the Apple touchpad didn't work very well. And we knew that because it was kind of our existence proof. If we could do better than that, we were doing pretty well because Apple was well thought of, even in those days. You could tell the longer he worked with it, he couldn't break it. And he kept trying things to break it. And finally he said, just wait here a minute. I want some other people to see this. So what we didn't know was that not only did the Apple touchpad not work very well, they were having horrible yield problems with it. And it was actually holding up the shipments of the PowerBooks, which were getting very popular. So they had this big waiting list for PowerBooks that was growing because they couldn't deliver the touchpads. We didn't know this, of course. But soon this young fella came back with a set of much more senior people, and they started looking at it and working with it and talking about it. And they said, excuse us just a minute, let us go talk about this. So they went back and had a conference, and they came back in and they said, this is very interesting. We'd like to talk to you about doing business with you. Well, that's when we gradually unwound the story of the fact that they didn't have a good design, and it was even worse than we thought. So that was wonderful news. Well, of course, getting into an Apple product, even in those days, was a huge challenge. They had a qualification process that was very, very hard to get through. They were known to be sticklers about every detail of a product, and you had to jump over a lot of hurdles. And a lot of companies didn't make it, and small companies almost never made it. Well, they assigned one of their top engineers to do nothing but work with us on getting qualified. And this fellow knew all the drill, and he coached us day by day through all of the tests and all of the qualification process. And we got through in record time. And we started producing touchpads to go in the Apple PowerBook. And that was what made us a real company, because going through that Apple qualification process made us a production company. We were not just making prototypes anymore. We were producing product, and we were producing quality product for a customer that was very picky. So Apple did us a huge favor. They were our first, well, I forget if we shipped more units to them than to Acer, but we certainly made more money from them as a lead customer than anyone else. And it really got us going as a company. It got us into volume production. It got us visible in the entire industry. And that was a wonderful, glorious time. So that's the way Synaptics became the touchpad company. And it became a successful business. It is a very successful business to this day, as you know. I do best when we're in the technology development stages of a company, and when it gets to be big business and finance and all that, that isn't what I can contribute to that much, so I stepped aside and let other people go ahead with that. I was professor at Caltech the whole time that this Synaptics thing was happening, and I was a consultant and member of the board at Synaptics. But I never stopped teaching, and that meant that I could only spend weekends there, but it also meant that a lot of the students got to watch this happening, and a lot of the students got to have the opportunity to work there when they were done if they wanted to. I never put pressure on any of my students to do any particular thing when they got a job. That's not the way you can be a professor. It's not okay. But many of the students did choose to work there. We had a great group of 10 or 12 of the former students, and at least Dave Gillespie is still there and doing what he always did when he was in the lab at Caltech. He was our guru, and I think he's still the guru for Synaptics. We had a really neat spirit going in the early Synaptics, which Dave tells me is still going. The young people were very creative, and Federico was very good not to suppress their creativity. He appreciated young people and the spirit and the creativity and the inventiveness. And it's the sort of thing that it isn't everyone that can appreciate that kind of environment. It was more like a research lab than a development organization. It was less tightly organized. It was more free-flowing. People would go contribute to each other's projects and pitch in when things needed to be done. And like everybody was off playing solitaire with the touchpad when it was first getting developed, because that was what needed to be done. And that was a great environment where it wasn't about people having a specific job and sticking to their job and not looking to the left or right. It was much more collaborative, much more fun for everyone. Well, I think both Federico and I felt that neural-inspired processing could bring better interfaces to the world, better vision, better hearing, better touch. And we didn't know quite what that meant, but we felt that there was a contribution to be made there. And it was more of a gut feeling than it was any specific thing, although the touchpad turned out to be a very specific thing. But in the beginning, it was more seeing and feeling that computers were pretty sterile in terms of how you interacted with them back then. And that was not the way it was going to be. We started Synaptics as a first real round of funding, I think in '86. And I worked with the company and stayed on the board until I think it was 96 or 7. And then we had a project to do an imaging system. And it didn't look like that was going to be on the path that Synaptics was going to take. And so we formed a joint venture with National Semiconductor with a little company called Foveon. And so I went over and did the technology development for Foveon. And that turned out to be successful. And those are the very high quality imaging chips that are in the Sigma cameras. And it's now, Foveon became part of Sigma because they were our only real customers. So it made more sense for it to end up there. There are always things that in hindsight you would do differently. I can't think of anything that at the time was obvious to do differently. But looking back, we did a lot of stupid things. And that's always true because hindsight's 20/20 and foresight doesn't work like that. But also a lot of things went right for us that we didn't have any business expecting to go right. I mean, we shouldn't have followed the Verifone thing as far as we did. We should have, handled that better. But, we learned a lot doing that. And the team got to working together and got to be more of a development and less of a research type of effort. So I think that taught us a lot. Even though it was a failure from a business perspective, I think it got us in a position where we could do the touchpad, which we probably weren't until we had done that little project. So yeah, I'm sure there are lots of things we would have done differently, but I can't think of one that we could have foreseen in any obvious way. Well, innovative companies, technology companies, the ones that end up successful are almost always a solution looking for a problem, not the other way around. Because if a problem is obvious and there's a market for it already, then the big companies in the business already know about it, and they'll figure that out. So a little company doesn't have a chance doing that. So little companies always invent things and then try to find places where they'll be useful. And that's always the big challenge for a small company, small technology company, is finding a place for the technology where it really adds value. And of course, it's obvious in today's world that touch is now the major way that people interface with computational devices. But in those days, that wasn't obvious at all. We had a board member that was watching all this, and I remember at one board meeting he said, touchpad. He said, that's penny ante stuff. I think I'd rather go to Las Vegas and just put the money on the table and pursue the touchpad. So that was how non-obvious it was, that it was a very important contribution to the evolution of technology to have touch sensing that worked really well. And that's, of course, proven out by everyone every day today who couldn't live without the touch interface to their devices. But at the time, that was, thought to be a almost trivial thing. So probably overcoming that disbelief that there would be real value added from this thing that looked like such a simple thing, I think that was probably our biggest challenge. We never articulated the core values for the company. We had a wonderful set of core values. And according to Dave, they're still going on in the company. I mentioned the collaborativeness, the positive sum nature of working together, that everybody wins when you work and help each other out, and that sort of thing. That was built in at the bottom level. But I don't think we ever said it. We just did it. And that became just the way the thing worked. I know everyone has told me they appreciated those times. They were really great times, working with really smart people on really challenging projects and getting things to really work. But I don't think we ever wrote down a set of values. I think it just emerged as we worked together. The future trend in human interface is, of course, not something I'm able to see very far. But it's clear that it hasn't gone very far. I mean, we can do touch, and Synaptics is doing that very nicely. There has not been very much progress in vision. The things that use pictures of people or images of a person's face are extraordinarily rudimentary in today's technology. And so are the things that use sound. There's some speech recognition that can make words out of a sound stream if everything's right, and that has come along better than the recognition and interpretation of visual scenes. So one of the things I expect to happen is that everyone has a camera that looks at them when they're on their computer or on their mobile device. And there's absolutely no reason why that information shouldn't be part of the user interface. And it isn't right now today in any sensible way. So I expect to see that. That's kind of obvious to everyone, I think, that we should have the voice and the image of the person's face and the touch all be part of a integrated interface. It doesn't take any big leap of faith to imagine that we can do that. Exactly how that's going to play out, you never know. It's very hard to predict what is going to catch on and what isn't. I'm terrible at doing that. Imagining what the capabilities might be is pretty easy from a technology perspective. But imagining what people are going to like and when they're going to like it is something I have absolutely no confidence in. You know, people are herd animals, and they go rushing off after this or that or the other gadget or way of doing things. And I can never predict what's going to happen there. So I can't help you with that side of it. I think every industry has an evolution curve where they start out very small groups of very bright people that are very innovative and try a lot of things and get directions and develop things quickly, and it's a very thrilling time. And then there's a period where it becomes very successful financially, and then gradually they become bigger and bigger businesses. They get more and more organized. They get less and less innovative, and eventually end up with mature companies which are very profitable but aren't nearly as innovative. And there have been a lot of attempts to keep innovation as part of big companies. I don't know anyone that has ever kept that going very long, but Silicon Valley as a place is certainly as vibrant and innovative as it's ever been. It just the targets of the innovation are quite different today than they were back then. In fact, there's a bunch of stuff going on which I don't even know about anymore because it isn't in my purview as a technologist. But it's certainly true that there are a lot of startup companies that are doing really great things, and that the area as a place where innovation happens is still world class. So I think that part of it is still doing great. But I think it's very hard for a very large company to keep the innovative spirit alive at the same level that it was when they were a small company. And I think that's why we see so many of the innovations happening in small companies, and then the larger companies acquire them when they feel that that technology is something they can make a business out of. And that's a quite healthy eco-structure for business to operate in. Go for it. Absolutely, go for it. Just passion. The people I know that have contributed have been passionate about it. And they have all different personality types. They have all different ways of going at things. They have all different kinds of thought process they contribute and approaches to things. But every one of them that makes a real contribution is passionate about it. And that's important. So when I have parents ask me about, oh, my little Johnny only thinks about computer games or blah, 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 and what do I do with my little Johnny? And I say, well, the one thing you mustn't do with your children is crush an interest in something. Because when they get interested in something, that can always be an experience that turns into something for life. But if you crush that interest, no matter what it is, they'll go through 2 or 3 of them and then they won't get interested in anything anymore. And I've seen that happen, and it just hurts when you see it happen. So don't do that to your kids. If they're passionate about something, let them be passionate about it, because that will drive them to go understand and figure things out and go for it. And it doesn't matter much what it is when they're young, because they'll change that 20 times by the time they settle on something.